The moment the sheriff stepped out of his cruiser and asked who owned the ground beneath our feet, the entire neighborhood barbecue went silent. The smell of hickory smoke drifted across my backyard as brisket crackled over the pit I'd been tending since sunrise. It was the first Saturday of June, 78 degrees, blue skies over Willow Creek Estates, and for the first time in months, my family was gathered together without a single problem in sight. Kids were chasing each other across the grass. My brother was arguing with my uncle about baseball. My mother was setting out homemade peach cobbler on a folding table that had seen more family cookouts than I could count. Then 3 patrol cars rolled slowly up my driveway. Their tires crunched over the gravel, and every conversation around me stopped at once. I set down my barbecue tongs and wiped my hands on a dish towel. The first person out wasn't a deputy. It was Melissa Thornton. She climbed out of her white SUV wearing oversized sunglasses and the kind of smile that always meant trouble. Melissa had been president of our HOA for nearly 4 years, and she carried herself like she owned every blade of grass in the subdivision. She marched across my lawn holding a folder against her chest while 2 deputies followed behind her. The smell of expensive perfume mixed with barbecue smoke as she approached. "Grant Walker," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This event is taking place on HOA common property. You've ignored multiple warnings. Law enforcement is here to address the situation." My niece stopped playing. My mother slowly lowered the pie server in her hand. I could feel dozens of eyes turning toward me. The strange thing was that I wasn't angry. Not yet. Because Melissa had tried versions of this before. Letters, complaints, threats, survey flags that appeared overnight and disappeared by morning. What made this different was the confidence in her voice. She genuinely believed she had won. One of the deputies shifted uncomfortably beside her. Then another vehicle pulled into the driveway behind the patrol cars. A county sheriff's truck. The engine shut off, and Sheriff Daniel Mercer stepped out. I'd known the sheriff by reputation for years. Quiet man, careful with his words. Not someone who enjoyed neighborhood disputes. Melissa's smile widened the moment she saw him. She practically waved him over like he was arriving to confirm her victory. Sheriff Mercer looked at her, then at me, then slowly scanned the tree line behind the barbecue pit. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Even the laughter from the kids had disappeared. Then he reached into a folder under his arm and looked directly at Melissa. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "are you aware you've been standing on Mr. Walker's property for the last 7 years?" The look on Melissa's face froze so completely that for a second I thought even she had forgotten how to speak. The sheriff's question hung in the warm summer air while thin ribbons of smoke curled up from the barbecue pit behind me. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a plate. Even the birds seemed quieter. Standing there watching it unfold, I could not help thinking about how strange it was that a fight over a few acres of land had started long before most of my neighbors ever moved into Willow Creek Estates. That stretch of property behind my backyard was never just dirt to my family. My grandfather, Thomas Walker, bought the original 43 acres in 1964 when this part of the county was mostly oak trees, cattle fences, and gravel roads. Back then there were no subdivisions, no decorative stone entrances, and definitely no homeowners association telling people what color mailbox they could own. The land was where my father learned to hunt, where my uncles camped during summers, and where every family celebration somehow ended with food cooking over an open fire. I can still remember being 8 years old and sitting beside my grandfather near the same patch of ground. The smell of charcoal, the crackle of mesquite wood, the rough texture of an old folding chair beneath me. He used to point toward the tree line and tell me that land ownership was not about money. It was about responsibility. You take care of the ground, and the ground takes care of you. Those words stuck with me. Years later, after my father passed away, the property came to me. Not because I was the oldest, not because I was the smartest, because everyone in the family knew I would protect it. I spent weekends repairing fences, clearing brush, and maintaining trails that had existed since before I was born. Every 4th of July, every Labor Day, every family reunion happened right there beneath those old oak trees. The barbecue pit sitting behind me that afternoon was not some recent project. My father built it with his own hands 21 years earlier using stone pulled directly from the property. Every mark on it carried a memory. Every scratch had a story. When Willow Creek Estates began expanding years ago, developers purchased farmland surrounding us. Streets appeared. Houses appeared. Then came the HOA. Most neighbors were decent people, but the community kept pushing closer to our boundary line. Little by little, things changed. Survey stakes disappeared. New maps appeared. Property lines seemed to move depending on who was drawing them. At first I thought it was confusion. Then I started noticing a pattern. The same section of land kept showing up in HOA documents. The same section where my family had been holding barbecues for nearly 60 years. And the first person who seemed determined to claim it was Melissa Thornton. Melissa Thornton arrived in Willow Creek Estates 8 years earlier, and within 6 months, she had figured out something most people never noticed. In neighborhoods like ours, power rarely belonged to the loudest person. It belonged to whoever was willing to sit through endless board meetings, memorize bylaws, and convince everyone else that they were acting in the community's best interest. Melissa understood that better than anyone. She started small. Volunteer committees, landscaping reviews, holiday decoration guidelines, harmless things that nobody cared enough to challenge. Then little by little, she inserted herself into everything. By the time she became HOA president, most residents barely remembered how it happened. They just accepted that Melissa was in charge. I remember the first time she knocked on my door. It was a warm spring afternoon. The smell of fresh-cut grass hung in the air, and I was repairing a fence near the back of my property. She walked up carrying a clipboard and wearing the same polished smile she always used when delivering bad news. She introduced herself, welcomed me to a new era of community improvement, and spent 20 minutes explaining future development plans. Most of it sounded harmless. New walking trails, updated entrances, beautification projects. Then she casually mentioned that the wooded section behind my barbecue area would be an excellent location for expanded community recreation access. Something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. It was subtle, almost invisible, but she talked about my land as though it already belonged to the neighborhood. Over the next few years, her influence grew. Residents received violation notices for things nobody had complained about before. Fence colors, garden sheds, vehicle placement. Some people fought back. Most gave up. The sound of certified mail trucks became almost as common as lawn mowers on Saturday mornings. Melissa always claimed she was protecting property values. Maybe some people believed her. I never did. What bothered me was how often her attention drifted toward the rear section of my property. The old family gathering area, the tree line, the open ground near the barbecue pit. She began referring to it in meetings as a natural community asset. Then came maps. At first they appeared in HOA newsletters. Small diagrams showing future walking paths and recreation zones. Every version seemed to push a little farther toward my family's land. Whenever I pointed it out, Melissa smiled and blamed drafting errors, administrative mistakes, miscommunications. The explanations always sounded reasonable until you noticed they kept happening in the exact same place. Neighbors started mentioning strange things. New survey flags appearing overnight. Temporary markers near the woods. Contractors walking areas where they had no reason to be. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that seemed important on its own. But together they formed a pattern I could not ignore. Looking back now, I realized Melissa had been laying groundwork for years. Not with bulldozers or lawsuits. With paperwork, assumptions, repetition, the kind of strategy that slowly changes what people believe is true. And the first sign that her plan was becoming something much bigger arrived one morning when I discovered that a property marker my grandfather had installed decades earlier had completely disappeared. The missing property marker bothered me far more than it probably should have. Most people would have looked at a weathered metal stake disappearing from the edge of a wooded lot and assumed it had been buried, knocked loose, or simply overlooked. But I knew exactly where that marker belonged because I had helped my father repaint it every few years. It sat near an old oak tree roughly 100 yards behind the barbecue area, marking a boundary that had remained unchanged for decades. The morning I noticed it was gone, the air smelled like damp soil from an overnight rain. I walked the property line carrying a shovel, convinced I would uncover it within a few minutes. Instead, I found fresh footprints, disturbed dirt, and a patch of ground that looked strangely smooth. The marker had not disappeared by accident. Someone had removed it. At first I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe a survey crew had moved it temporarily. Maybe the county was conducting work nearby. But 2 weeks later, a bright orange flag appeared nearly 20 feet inside my property line. Then another. Then another. The placement made no sense. Standing there in the afternoon heat, listening to cicadas buzzing from the trees, I felt the first rail warning bell go off in my head. Somebody was trying to redefine boundaries that had existed for generations. When I contacted the county survey office, they told me no official work had been authorized in that section. That answer should have ended the mystery. Instead, it made everything worse. A month later, Melissa unveiled a new community improvement proposal during an HOA meeting. I attended mostly out of curiosity. The clubhouse smelled like stale coffee and printer paper. Folding chairs filled the room, and a projector displayed colorful maps on a large screen. That was when I saw it. One of the proposed walking trails cut directly across the same section of land where my missing property marker had stood. Melissa spoke confidently, clicking through slides while residents nodded along. She described future recreational opportunities, community gathering spaces, and enhanced property values. Then she pointed toward an area labeled Future Woodland Access Corridor. My stomach tightened immediately. The corridor sat exactly where my family property was located. When I raised my hand and questioned the map, Melissa smiled as though she had been expecting it. She claimed the drawings were preliminary, conceptual only, nothing final. The room moved on, but I noticed something important. She never actually denied that the land belonged to me. She simply avoided answering. Over the following months, the pressure increased. Temporary signs appeared near the woods. HOA maintenance crews started mowing farther and farther beyond their normal routes. Visitors walked trails that did not officially exist yet. Each incident seemed small enough to dismiss on its own. Together, they painted a different picture. Someone was slowly teaching the neighborhood to believe that my family's land was already community property. And the strangest part was that every time I documented one problem, another appeared somewhere else. It felt less like coincidence and more like a carefully planned campaign. The campaign shifted into a different gear after that. The disappearing markers and wandering maintenance crews were irritating, but paperwork was where Melissa truly excelled. Paperwork left trails. Paperwork created pressure. Paperwork made ordinary people surrender without a fight. The first certified letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the metallic clang of the mailbox door and the smell of fresh rain on the gravel driveway as I carried the envelope back to the house. According to the HOA, I was maintaining unauthorized structures near a future community access area. The wording was careful. They never directly claimed ownership of my land. Instead, they described everything as though ownership was already under review. That distinction mattered more than most people would realize. Over the following months, the letters multiplied. One questioned fence placement. Another referenced vegetation management. Another claimed community members had reported restricted access to recreational space. Recreational space. They were talking about my family's property as though it already belonged to the neighborhood. Every envelope felt like another brick added to a wall slowly being built around me. The smell of printer ink became strangely familiar. So did the sound of certified mail trucks stopping in front of my house. I responded to every notice. I attached records, survey documents, tax assessments, historical maps. Each response took hours. Every answer generated another question. Melissa never seemed interested in resolving anything. She was interested in creating exhaustion. Some neighbors started treating me differently. Nothing dramatic, just subtle changes. Conversations ended when I approached. A few people repeated rumors that the disputed area might eventually become community land. Others assumed the HOA had information they did not. That was the real power of repetition. If people hear something often enough, they begin accepting it as fact. The pressure spread beyond paperwork. During community meetings, Melissa began referring to long-term planning goals involving the wooded section behind my property. Every presentation included maps. Every map looked slightly different from the last. Yet somehow the boundaries always drifted in the same direction. One evening I sat in the back row listening to her explain future improvements while the projector hummed softly against the clubhouse wall. She spoke with complete confidence. Residents nodded along. The room smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. Looking around, I realized most people were not paying attention to property lines. They were listening to promises. Walking trails, green space, higher home values. Melissa understood that. She knew perception often mattered more than facts. Still, I refused to back down. I organized documents, took photographs, recorded dates, kept notes. If someone moved a marker, I documented it. If signs appeared, I photographed them. If maps changed, I saved copies. I did not know exactly what game Melissa was playing, but I knew enough to recognize a pattern. Then one evening, an elderly neighbor named Walter Jennings stopped me near the mailbox cluster. He glanced around to make sure nobody was listening before leaning closer. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Grant," he said, "there is something you need to see, and I think Melissa hopes nobody ever finds it." Walter Jennings had lived in Willow Creek longer than almost anyone still around. He was 76 years old, walked with a slight limp from an old construction accident, and remembered details most people had forgotten decades earlier. The next evening, he invited me to his garage. The place smelled like machine oil, sawdust, and old cardboard boxes. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight coming through the windows, while an ancient fan rattled in the corner. Walter did not waste time. He pulled a weathered file folder from a metal cabinet and laid it across a workbench. Inside were photographs, newsletters, meeting notices, and copies of documents stretching back nearly 10 years. At first, nothing seemed remarkable. Then I started noticing dates. Certain maps looked different from the versions I had saved. Property outlines shifted slightly from one year to the next. Walking trail proposals moved a few feet at a time. Recreation areas expanded in tiny increments. Each individual change looked insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Melissa had not tried to take land all at once. She had been slowly redefining where people believed the boundaries existed. Walter pointed to an aerial photograph taken years before the first dispute. The image showed my property exactly as it appeared on county records. Then he showed me another image distributed by the HOA several years later. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. A section of my wooded acreage had been shaded the same color as community land. No explanation, no vote, no legal transfer, just a different color on a map. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. The more we reviewed, the clearer the picture became. Walter explained that he had raised concerns years earlier, but nobody paid attention. Residents trusted HOA documents because they assumed somebody had verified them. Most people never checked county records. Why would they? They believed the maps were accurate. That assumption became Melissa's greatest advantage. The sound of papers sliding across the workbench filled the garage as we continued digging. Then Walter handed me something that made my pulse quicken. It was an old community newsletter featuring a photograph from a neighborhood cleanup event. In the background stood one of my grandfather's original boundary markers. The date printed beneath the image was 6 years after Melissa claimed the marker location had always been uncertain. There was in plain sight, visible, undisputed, documented. For the first time, I had proof that somebody knew exactly where the property line belonged. As the evening sun dipped lower outside the garage, Walter leaned against the workbench and folded his arms. His expression turned serious. "Grant," he said quietly, "these papers explain part of it. But there is another reason Melissa never wanted anyone looking too closely at those boundaries." I stared at him. He nodded toward a second file, sitting unopened on the shelf. "Because somebody filed complaints years ago, and those complaints reached the sheriff's office." The next morning, I drove to the county records building before the summer heat settled across town. The courthouse lawn had just been watered, and the smell of damp grass followed me all the way to the entrance. Walter's words had stayed with me all night. Complaints, sheriff's office, boundaries. None of it made sense yet, but I could feel the pieces beginning to connect. After several phone calls and more paperwork than I care to remember, I finally managed to locate a records clerk willing to help. She disappeared into a back room for nearly 20 minutes before returning with a storage box covered in faded inventory labels. The cardboard looked old enough to vote. Inside were copies of correspondence stretching back years. Most involved routine property questions, but buried beneath those papers sat something far more interesting. A series of complaints filed by residents regarding unauthorized activity near the wooded section bordering my family's land. The reports came from different people, different years, different circumstances. Yet every complaint described the same problem. Survey markers being relocated, temporary signs appearing without authorization, maintenance crews operating beyond approved areas. None of the reports resulted in criminal investigations because the incidents seemed minor when viewed individually. But together they created a timeline that stretched nearly 7 years. My pulse quickened as I turned page after page. Then I found Sheriff Daniel Mercer's name, not as an investigator, as a reviewer. Several complaints had crossed his desk because they involved disputed property boundaries. In each case, the conclusion remained the same. County records recognized the original property lines. No transfer had ever occurred. No legal modification had ever been approved. The boundaries remained exactly where they had always been. The sound of an air conditioning vent hummed softly above me while I sat frozen in the records room. Melissa's entire narrative depended on convincing people those boundaries were uncertain. Yet county records repeatedly confirmed the opposite. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Attached to one complaint was a collection of photographs taken during a site inspection years earlier. In the background stood temporary HOA signage positioned several feet inside my property. Another image showed maintenance equipment operating beyond community land. Date stamps confirmed the photos had been taken long before any dispute became public. Long before Melissa started claiming the area belonged to the HOA. The evidence was not dramatic. No shocking confession. No secret deed. Just years of documentation quietly proving that people acting on behalf of the HOA had repeatedly crossed onto land they did not own. Suddenly, Sheriff Mercer's question at my barbecue made perfect sense. He was not reacting to something new. He was reacting to a pattern he had already seen before. And when I finally reached the last folder in the box, I discovered one final document that explained why he had arrived personally that afternoon. That final document was a memorandum from the sheriff's office written nearly 3 years before the barbecue. The paper itself looked ordinary, but the contents explained why Sheriff Mercer had stepped out of his truck that afternoon with the calm confidence of someone who already knew the answer. According to the memorandum, multiple residents had raised concerns about recurring boundary disputes involving HOA projects. Rather than opening formal cases every time a sign appeared or a marker moved, the county had chosen to maintain a reference file documenting incidents as they occurred. The purpose was simple. If a larger dispute ever emerged, investigators would already have a historical record. Sitting in that records room, I could almost hear the pieces locking together. Melissa had spent years creating the appearance of uncertainty. Meanwhile, county records had quietly preserved evidence showing the exact opposite. When I returned to the present moment in my mind, I remembered the silence hanging over my backyard as Sheriff Mercer opened his folder in front of everyone. The smell of smoked brisket still drifted through the air. Plates sat untouched on picnic tables. Melissa stood with her arms crossed, waiting for validation that never arrived. Sheriff Mercer removed several maps and spread them across a folding table near the barbecue pit. Paper rustled softly in the breeze. Curious neighbors stepped closer. Deputies leaned in to look. One map showed the current county survey. Another displayed archived property records. A third contained aerial imagery taken years apart. The more documents he revealed, the clearer the pattern became. Every official record placed the property line exactly where my family had always maintained it. Then came the photographs. Images of survey markers. Images of temporary signs. Images of maintenance equipment positioned beyond HOA land. Dates stretched back years. Nobody needed legal training to understand what they were seeing. Melissa's confidence began to fade. The expression on her face shifted from certainty to disbelief as neighbors examined the evidence themselves. Questions started coming from every direction. People who had trusted HOA maps suddenly wanted explanations. Residents who had ignored the dispute now saw the timeline with their own eyes. Sheriff Mercer never raised his voice. He simply presented facts. One document after another. One photograph after another. The truth did the work for him. The sound of pages turning mixed with the distant chirping of birds from the tree line. It was strangely peaceful considering how much was changing. Years of assumptions unraveled in less than 30 minutes. The most powerful moment arrived when a county surveyor, invited by the sheriff's office as a neutral witness, confirmed the boundary markers using official coordinates. The result matched every historical record. The same property line my grandfather had protected decades earlier remained exactly where it had always been. Standing there beside the barbecue pit, surrounded by family, neighbors, and county officials, I realized the fight was finally ending. But Melissa was about to discover that proving ownership was only the beginning of her problems. The strange thing about justice is that when it finally arrives, it rarely sounds dramatic. There was no cheering crowd, no grand speech, no sudden victory music playing in the background. Instead, there was only the soft rustle of papers, the smell of smoked brisket drifting through the afternoon air, and the quiet realization spreading across the faces of everyone standing in my backyard. Once the surveyor finished his verification, Sheriff Mercer calmly explained what the records showed. The disputed land had never belonged to the HOA. The property boundaries had never changed. Years of maps, assumptions, and community rumors could not override official county records. Several residents immediately began asking questions about previous HOA projects. Others wanted to know why community documents had repeatedly shown different boundaries. Melissa tried to defend herself at first. She talked about misunderstandings, planning concepts, and administrative errors. But the explanations sounded weaker every time another document appeared on the table. The same neighbors who had once accepted her version of events now had access to the actual records. Facts have a way of changing conversations. By late afternoon, the crowd had shifted completely. People were no longer looking at me as the source of the dispute. They were looking at the paperwork, looking at the maps, looking at the timeline. Sheriff Mercer informed everyone that county officials would review the documented boundary issues and determine whether any additional administrative action was necessary. He did not need to threaten anyone. The evidence spoke for itself. Melissa eventually gathered her folder, removed her sunglasses, and walked back toward her vehicle without another word. The woman who had spent years presenting herself as the authority on property lines could not argue with the actual property records. After the vehicles left, something unexpected happened. Nobody rushed home. Neighbors stayed. Conversations started. People compared old newsletters, photographs, and memories. Residents who had barely spoken to one another for months suddenly had plenty to discuss. The tension that had hovered over the community for years seemed to dissolve with the afternoon heat. My mother finally returned to the dessert table. My brother uncovered the barbecue trays again. Kids resumed running across the grass as though nothing unusual had happened. The smell of hickory smoke returned to the center of everything. Later that evening, just before sunset, Sheriff Mercer came back by himself. He accepted a plate of brisket, leaned against the fence, and looked toward the tree line where my grandfather's old property markers still stood. The golden light filtered through the oak branches exactly the way I remembered from childhood. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he smiled and took a bite. I looked across the land my family had protected for generations and realized my grandfather had been right all along. Ownership was never just about deeds or boundaries. It was about responsibility. The ground beneath my feet had not changed. The truth had simply caught up to it. Justice is not loud. It is patient, and sooner or later, it always finds the right address. The sun was already dropping behind the oak trees when the last county vehicle disappeared down the road. Long shadows stretched across the grass, and the air carried that familiar mix of charcoal, smoke, and fresh-cut hay that always reminded me of summers with my grandfather. The strange tension that had hung over the property for years seemed to dissolve with the daylight. For the first time in a long time, nobody was arguing about maps, boundaries, or HOA notices. People were simply standing around talking like neighbors again. My mother finally brought out the peach cobbler that had been sitting untouched on the table all afternoon. My brother restarted a conversation about baseball that had been interrupted hours earlier. Children ran between the picnic tables, laughing as though the entire dispute had never happened. The sound felt different now, lighter, real. Several neighbors walked over to apologize for believing the rumors. I told them not to worry about it. That was the thing about misinformation. It spreads quietly until people stop questioning it. What mattered was that they had finally seen the truth with their own eyes. A few days later, word spread through the neighborhood that the HOA board had scheduled an emergency meeting. Residents who had never attended before suddenly showed up. Questions were asked. Records were reviewed. Explanations were demanded. Melissa's influence, built over years of assumptions and confidence, began fading almost overnight. She had spent so long controlling the narrative that she never expected anyone to examine the foundation underneath it. Back on my property, life returned to normal. I replaced the missing boundary marker with a new one beside the old oak tree. The metallic ring of the post driver echoed through the woods as I secured it into the same ground my grandfather had trusted decades earlier. Standing there, I realized the marker itself was never the important part. The principle was. Some things are worth protecting simply because they are right. A week later, Sheriff Mercer stopped by one final time. He stood beside the barbecue pit, looked toward the tree line, and nodded. No speeches, no congratulations, just a quiet acknowledgement that the matter was settled. As evening settled across the property, I watched smoke rise slowly into the orange sky and listened to the familiar sounds of family gathering around the tables. The land had not changed. The records had not changed. The truth had not changed. The only thing that changed was that people finally stopped ignoring it. And standing there beneath those old trees, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice again. The ground takes care of you when you take care of it. Turns out he was right.